China is in chaos. It's 1966, and Chairman Mao Zedong has unleashed the Cultural Revolution. Students are encouraged to rise up against their teachers. So-called Red Guards destroy anything reminiscent of the old ways. Over the next 10 years, hundreds of thousands of people will be killed. Though the Cultural Revolution is a catastrophe for China, it is a success for Mao. He will remain in control of the world's most populous country. History is littered with examples of how dictators have come to power. But what are the common themes? What are the circumstances that lead to tyranny? And what techniques do they use to get to the top? Dictators believe they have the answer to fix society's problems. They have a vision of what their nation could be. But once they've grabbed power, a dictator faces a new challenge. They need to subdue any opposition. They need to divide their enemies. They need to keep the masses in line. They need to find a way to hold on to power. Dictators share many common characteristics. They're charismatic, narcissistic, and sadistic. But most of all, they crave power.
They are driven by this unrelenting thirst to remain in power.
A dictator has many enemies, from both their inner circle and from outside, ranging from the elite to the masses. So, having attained power, a dictator must then focus on staying in power.
And once they grab power, they monopolize power and crush all competitors.
There are several common strategies that dictatorships use to stay in power. One of the most used strategies, of course, is to be repressive.
A dictator may play rivals off against each other, have them imprisoned, murdered, or both. They may seek to control the military, or sway the masses with propaganda. They might even ingratiate themselves by improving the power base's standard of living, often to the detriment of others. But no matter how a dictator holds on to power, they are frequently willing to do whatever it takes to keep it. The public face of a regime is indispensable. No one understood this better than Mao Zedong, who became chairman of the People's Republic of China when the communists seized control in 1949. Despite many setbacks, Mao would hold on to power for nearly 30 years. Immediately after the communists defeated Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists, a hastily sketched portrait of Mao appeared over the main gate of the Forbidden City in Beijing. China had entered a new era that would come as a huge jolt to the nation's more than 500 million people. Nearly 30 years of on-and-off civil war was over, and the victorious communists now faced the challenge of reshaping the nation.
The party is that revolutionary vanguard party in power, but now they have to walk the walk. You came to power on the force of revolution, on the promise of revolution. You must continue the revolution.
Mao modeled himself on Stalin and quickly sought to impose absolute control over the lives of everyday Chinese, collectivizing agriculture and eliminating private property. Collectivization meant landlords and figures who exploited the peasantry were violently overthrown. These land reform campaigns led to the deaths of millions of people. The violence continued through the 1950s, as Mao undertook a series of Stalinist purges to maintain control.
Because the party has never governed over an entire country like China before, the party has to come up with a system to eliminate what they view as perceived enemies, real and imagined.
At the same time, the regime undertook a literary purge, burning or pulping on a colossal scale those books deemed anti-communist or anti-Maoist. Mao became the dominant topic and author, with his various essays, poems, and quotes printed and distributed in vast quantities. Newspapers, magazines, and photographs were also used for propaganda purposes, and Mao was promoted as a visionary, a philosopher king.
In China, the word propaganda doesn't necessarily have a negative connotation. Propaganda for the Chinese is about trying to convince and persuade the public about important ideals and values.
Mao took many of his cues from his Soviet counterpart, Joseph Stalin, but in the 1950s, a rift grew between their nations.
Mao regarded Stalin as one of the world's foremost Marxists. He really valued him as a theoretician, as a particularly brilliant strategist of Marxism, and someone who inherited Lenin's legacy.
However, Stalin felt threatened by the emergence of China as a major communist player. He put pressure on Mao to slow down the collectivization process. When Stalin died in 1953, Mao made his agricultural collectives more widespread and took over all commerce and industry in the cities. This devastated the economy and created widespread discontentment. A further problem emerged for Mao when, in 1956, the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev gave a long speech in the Kremlin denouncing Stalin and the reign of terror he'd imposed.
When Khrushchev initiates de-Stalinization in the mid-50s, Mao begins to regard the Soviet Union as a revisionist. He sees this as problematic. To say that Stalin made mistakes is one thing, but to de-Stalinize is to revise the global communist movement to ignore his important contributions as a theorist.
Khrushchev felt that the main decision-making body in the Soviet Union should be the Politburo, rather than a single person. This led to senior Chinese Communist Party leaders calling for a similar approach in Beijing. Maoism as a doctrine, known as Mao Zedong thought, was removed from the constitution, and Mao found himself sidelined within his own party. After less than 10 years as leader, Mao risked losing all he had built. But he would not relinquish his grip on power without a fight. In 1934, a year after he became Chancellor of Germany, Adolf Hitler faced a similar problem. The threat came from the Sturmabteilung, or SA, the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party, and in particular its zealous leader, Ernst Röhm. If Hitler was to maintain his grip on power, something had to be done. The two men had once been friends. Hitler had trusted Röhm and appointed him head of the SA to improve discipline and their loyalty to himself. But Röhm was ambitious and stepped up recruitment, so that by mid-1934, SA membership was in the millions. Rumors swirled that Röhm might try to topple Hitler.
The SA in particular become increasingly rowdy in the late 1933 and early 1934. They're not falling in line, and I think Hitler realizes that to stay in power he needs to have full control over his own party and to crush those uncontrolled radical elements within his own party, which he does.
On the 30th of June, 1934, Hitler ordered the arrest and execution of Röhm and dozens of other SA leaders.
So Hitler took the opportunity not only to deal with Röhm, who was assassinated that night, but also to murder a whole host of other political opponents.
At the end of 3 days, the death toll stood at 85, though it was possibly much higher. This incident became known as the Night of the Long Knives.
He really used the opportunity of that night as part of his consolidation of power in very, very bloody and brutal terms to sort of settle scores with opponents, critics, and really to then set the stage even more for his infallibility, for his complete autocratic rule, not only of the party, but also of the state.
The response among the German public was largely positive, as they saw the SA as a threat to their safety. The SA was gradually phased out over the next few years, and neither it nor any other part of the Nazi machine posed a serious threat to Hitler again. Whereas Hitler's history within the Nazi Party ensured that he was indivisible from it, the leader of the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin, did not have that advantage. To hold on to power and to combat internal dissenters and external threats, Stalin decided to take drastic steps. In the 1930s, the Soviet dictator transformed political oppression into a sustained policy of terror, murdering around 750,000 people and imprisoning around 1 million more. For Stalin, the underlying purpose of the purges was self-preservation rather than protecting the interests of the party. Counter-revolutionaries, political opponents, and so-called fifth-column minorities became victims of the purges. Monstrous though this tactic was, it was also brutally effective in consolidating Stalin's power. Through sheer terror, Stalin had strengthened his grip over his party. And with internal power secured, he turned his attention to the looming external threats to his regime. In the late 1930s, it was evident that Nazi Germany was gearing up for war, and Hitler had made no secret of the fact that he loathed both communists and Slavs. It was also becoming increasingly clear that Hitler wanted Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people, and that he was prepared to go to war to get it. For Stalin, invasion by the German war machine was the ultimate threat to his power.
Pretty much everything Stalin does throughout the 30s is about getting ready for war.
Despite, or perhaps because of the risk all-out war posed to Stalin's leadership, from 1938 to 1941, Soviet factories pumped out tens of thousands of guns, tanks, and planes.
The minimum program was to keep the Soviet Union out of active fighting as long as possible, because Stalin probably quite rightly felt that the country was not ready for a major war.
One way for Stalin to gain more time was to make an agreement with potential threats. So, in August 1939, the Soviet Union entered into a non-aggression pact with Germany. It's known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, after the foreign ministers who signed it.
So the reason why this strange alliance between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany came to pass was essentially that Hitler made a better offer than the Western Allies. The Western Allies would not have offered a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. Germany was willing to offer that, always expecting that they would eventually break that pact anyway.
Stalin also believed that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact would lead Hitler to turn his attention westwards, and that Germany and France would fight a grinding war of attrition. This would exhaust both countries while giving him time to strengthen his position. However, Hitler swept through France faster than Stalin had predicted. And then, in June 1941, after conquering most of continental Europe, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. The pact had ultimately fallen apart. Even though the German war machine was now on their doorstep, Stalin and the Soviet Union had gained time to prepare for war. And the Soviet leader's forward thinking ensured he would remain in power for as long as his country could fight. 1941 was also the year Germany invaded Yugoslavia, and in so doing, created the circumstances that produced that country's post-war leader, Josip Broz Tito. Inasmuch as there can be a benign dictator, Tito was such a person, and his popularity and political instincts would enable him to hold power for almost 30 years.
Tito was probably one of the more popular leaders during the Cold War, and he was able to lead Yugoslavia for a long period of time by trying to unite the various republics under this Yugoslav identity.
Tito's early life contributed to his popularity while in power. paving the way for his long reign.
Tito was born in the late 19th century. He was Croatian and Catholic. As a young man, he was a worker, and he fought in the Austrian-Hungarian army in World War I. Was called prisoner on the Russian front, and as a prisoner of war in Russia, he discovered Bolshevism and enrolled in the pro-Soviet units formed among POWs.
In the 1930s, Tito traveled to the Soviet Union, where he impressed Stalin, who appointed him head of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. When the Germans invaded Yugoslavia, Tito led a large army of partisans who waged guerrilla warfare against the occupiers.
It was a multi-ethnic army with no group being privileged over the other groups or favored. And Tito was the commander-in-chief, and they achieved a number of victories over the German army, to such a point that the German army withdrew from Yugoslavia.
By late 1944, the partisans, with Soviet support, had liberated much of Yugoslavia. And the following year, Tito was elected prime minister. Through 1945, Tito consolidated his power as dictator through fraudulent elections and Soviet-style purges. However, Tito's main challenge upon taking office was how to manage his relationship with Stalin. The Soviet Union had emerged from the war with most of Eastern Europe firmly in its grip. Tito, however, wanted Yugoslavia to be an independent communist state.
He didn't accept to be patronized by Stalin, but Stalin wanted him to behave like an obedient mouthpiece for him. And Tito wanted a certain sense of autonomy. He wanted to be, to say it bluntly, the Stalin of the Balkans.
In 1948, Stalin tried to purge the Yugoslav leadership, and it's likely he tried to have Tito assassinated several times. When all of this failed, he excluded Yugoslavia from the Cominform, the alliance of Eastern European communist countries. Diplomacy became Tito's strategy to remain in power. He turned to the West, becoming a de facto member of NATO and positioning Yugoslavia as a neutral country. Western nations recognized the benefit of being on good terms with a nation so well placed strategically. In 1950, the U.S. loaned Yugoslavia $40 million to help keep its economy afloat. After Stalin died in 1953, Tito's relations with the Soviet Union improved, but his commitment to neutrality remained firm. Challenges to Tito's rule came not only from the outside, they also came from within. Yugoslavia was a federated nation made up of 6 republics and 2 autonomous provinces, each with distinct ethnic identities. To remain dictator, Tito had to keep these republics together by suppressing nationalist movements. One way he did this was to cultivate the myth that every ethnic group had contributed to the defeat of the Germans in World War II. He also fostered the idea that the disparate republics had a common enemy in the Soviet Union. In addition, Tito's ability to borrow money from the West kept living standards high, reducing the likelihood of discontentment that might lead to ethnic tensions.
He tried to ensure that communism didn't force people to suffer. He was willing and open-minded about taking a different pathway with communism, not only just being the leader of the non-aligned movement to distance himself from the Soviet Union, but also ensuring that the style of communism that the Yugoslavs faced was a little bit softer, a little bit less repressive.
Though relatively benign and liberal, Tito did have a secret police, which he used to suppress opposition. Especially in the early years of his regime, he ordered thousands of political opponents to be sent to hard labor re-education camps. Tito died in office in 1980, aged 87. From that moment on, Yugoslavia began to lose its cohesion. Over the next decade, as each constituent republic asserted their independence, political and ethnic divisions eventually devolved into civil war.
Tito's legacy was one of political daring, of political boldness, of political vision, but also a legacy of illusions. It was fundamentally a test for the possibility of multiculturalism and multi-ethnicity. And one can simply say, if it didn't work in Yugoslavia, would it work somewhere else?
Tito's shrewd diplomacy helped him stay in power for almost 3 decades. But Yugoslavia without Tito fell apart. It revealed the dangers of dictatorships and how they might hide deeper problems rather than solve them. Half a century earlier, in Spain, another dictator rose to power and held on to it for even longer than Tito. The civil war that made General Francisco Franco dictator of Spain took the lives of 500,000 people. Franco had attained absolute power. Now he had to hold on to it in a country divided and devastated by war. The so-called Generalissimo knew that he depended on the backing of the military. Despite the country's economic problems, Franco always made sure that money flowed to the armed forces. This kept him happy, but it also meant he had a substantial bulwark against any unrest.
Franco, above all, was determined to maintain himself in power, and for that he was able to be flexible in his politics, in how much power he was giving to certain groups instead of the others.
Franco's willingness to shift politics meant that he survived many different historical contexts over the course of his long reign.
He survived not just the early 1940s with the rise of fascism in Europe. He survives the end of the Second World War. How he survives the end of the Second World War? Well, he defascistized his dictatorship in order to emphasize that his regime is a Catholic regime.
In 1953, Spain signed the Vatican Concordat. It gave the Church more independence within Spain, but it also meant that the regime now enjoyed the full support of the Pope. This gave Franco a huge boost to his legitimacy. The Church was intimately involved in another way in which Franco's regime manipulated the Spanish population: censorship. The Spanish Catholic Church had a profound influence on, and often controlled, censorship decisions made by the state. An essential part of any dictatorship is eliminating dissent as much as possible. While Franco imprisoned or executed individual dissenters, state censorship also made it virtually impossible for people to speak up against the regime. Books, radio, television, film, music, and public performances were all heavily censored by government officials, as Franco sought to control the narrative around his regime.
Franco was not particularly charismatic. There was a process of construction of his figure in propaganda. That was huge propaganda about what Franco meant. But there was very little inside that propaganda that was true. I mean, he was a very simple, rather mediocre, not a particularly brilliant military officer, but he was cautious in what he was doing, careful, slow in dealing with things, and that was perhaps one of the secrets of his staying in power for so long.
Nunca me movió la ambición de mando. The press was not only censored, but used as a propaganda tool by the regime. In addition, Franco sought to impose national uniformity by making Castilian Spanish the only language that was permitted to be spoken. To stay in power, the ever-flexible Franco used different techniques at different times as the need arose. And as he navigated the geopolitics of the Cold War, he would demonstrate that there's more to controlling the masses than just propaganda and uniformity. Like Spain, censorship and propaganda would be powerful tools used to hold power in China as well. By 1957, Mao Zedong had overcome the political implications of Khrushchev's anti-Stalin speech and was once again head of the Chinese Communist Party. He now turned his attention to industrial production. Mao called it the Great Leap Forward, and it involved the merging of agricultural collectives into giant communes that focused on producing steel over growing food.
This economic reconfiguration is an effort by the CCP to increase steel production up to the level where it surpasses England's steel output and brings it up to equal and even surpass the Soviet Union's.
As part of this process, he ramped up the deification of himself as an infallible font of wisdom and truth. Mao demanded absolute loyalty and zero criticism.
Ultimately, the Great Leap Forward is an abject disaster, arguably the greatest disaster in the PRC's entire history.
Upwards of 45 million people died from starvation, torture, or summary execution. This was history's biggest episode of mass murder ever recorded. By October 1960, the economy was in tatters, and Mao realized he had to shut down the project. However, despite the deaths of so many of his people and mounting criticism of him, Mao's position was still as strong as it had ever been. He still controlled the hearts and minds of the nation. In contrast to the book burnings and censorship that characterized the start of the People's Republic, one book, first published in 1964, has become synonymous with Mao and his regime. This has become known as the Little Red Book.
These decontextualized assortment of Mao quotes from his various essays that originally the CCP printed just for soldiers to have them find moral and education value in their daily routines, but this becomes an idea that kind of a technique that the party uses to spread Maoism throughout the country and then throughout the world.
Published in its millions and distributed beyond the People's Liberation Army, it helped put Mao himself, not just the regime, at the center of Chinese life. But it was the decade-long Cultural Revolution that began in 1966 that really cemented Mao's position. At an ideological level, its purpose was to root out traces of capitalist culture in the communist state. But Mao also hoped that it would foster loyalty to himself. As a bonus, it gave him the chance to purge those party leaders who had dared to cross it. It began with the so-called May 16th notification in 1966, which Mao released at a conference in Beijing. It warned that class enemies had infiltrated the party and that they intended to restore power to a bourgeois elite.
And then by the Cultural Revolution, propaganda will again be much more firebrand in its criticism of the old world. You're young and you're the future of our country. No matter where you are in Chinese society, you have a role to play towards realizing Mao's grand vision.
Mao endorsed a call to arms that led to students revolting against their teachers. Young demonstrators marched through Beijing, wielding giant portraits of Mao.
This centrality of Mao's image really actually creates Mao as this iconic symbolic capital, right? This person who's more than just a name. He's a symbol that you wear. He's words that you carry and subscribe to in your daily life. He's omnipresent in your daily practices through the posters and the photos that you have framed in your house. And the Mao cult really stems from that.
Mass rallies were held in Beijing's Tiananmen Square, attended by millions of Red Guards, all eager to set eyes on the chairman as he drove among them in an open-top vehicle. The Cultural Revolution lasted for 10 years and led to the deaths of at least 1 million people as the country appeared to descend into civil war, with factions fighting over what the revolution even stood for. But for Mao Zedong, those 10 violent years marked a definitive return to power. Though the Cultural Revolution represented a catastrophic loss of human life, there was one foreign observer who thought Mao's divisive and brutal strategy had merit. A Cambodian communist called Saloth Sa, better known as Pol Pot. The Cambodian dictator only held on to power for 4 years, but in that short time, he turned his country upside down. He inflicted vast suffering and killed around 2 million of his own people, at least a quarter of the population. In 1968, Pol Pot became the head of the insurgent group, the Khmer Rouge, a popular title for members of the Communist Party of Kampuchea. The group launched a national uprising, basing themselves in the jungle, from which they fought a guerrilla war against the government. At the same time, the U.S., mired in the Vietnam War, was bombing large swathes of rural Cambodia, where they believed North Vietnamese troops had based themselves. In the process, they killed hundreds of thousands of Cambodians. Legions of disaffected rural Cambodians swelled the ranks of the Khmer Rouge, such that in 1975, they were able to defeat the army and occupy the capital, Phnom Penh. Pol Pot was now dictator of Cambodia.
Not unlike with the Chinese Communist Party, they were now governing over a country. Now, not one as big and not one as ethno-geographically diverse as China, but one that nevertheless was bigger and more populous than they were used to.
Influenced by Marxist-Leninist and Maoist thought, the Khmer Rouge quickly set to work enforcing an especially draconian and bizarre form of communism. They made anyone living in a city walk to re-education camps in the country, where people were forced to work 18-hour days on starvation rations in appalling conditions. Children were separated from their parents and indoctrinated to love the party rather than their families. Pol Pot sealed Cambodia off from the outside world, renamed it the Democratic Republic of Kampuchea, and declared that 1975 was year zero.
They also abolished currency, abolished religion, defrocked and embarrassed and humiliated and even killed Buddhist monks. They outlawed Islam, because a lot of Cambodians are Cham Muslims. They also tried to reform society around agricultural cultivation rather than industrialization.
The Khmer Rouge controlled every aspect of a person's life. They outlawed everything from private property to most reading material. Anyone who was considered a class enemy, such as teachers, government officials, lawyers, or doctors, were beaten, tortured, or killed, especially in the notorious S21, a torture and execution center. In a society ruled by terror, it was virtually impossible for anyone to rise up against Pol Pot. By 1977, having created a toxic atmosphere of paranoia and distrust, the Khmer Rouge began turning on one another. Party leaders and their families were routinely purged. But the regime was toppled not by internal elements, but by foreign intervention. Ultimately, Pol Pot's undoing was his 1977 invasion of Vietnam.
These invasions and the subsequent counter-invasion meant that people were all too willing and likely too malnourished and too weak to even support the Khmer Rouge anymore. So I'd say certainly that's the big kind of turning point for his rule. But honestly, the wheels came off pretty early for this movement.
The Vietnamese army defeated the Khmer Rouge and installed a puppet government. Pol Pot fled back to the jungle, where, remarkably, he waged guerrilla warfare until he died in 1998. His legacy, and that of the Khmer Rouge more broadly, are some 20,000 mass graves around Cambodia, known as the Killing Fields. A brutal reminder of a ruthless dictator that thought he could hold power by repression alone. If Pol Pot had Marxist-Leninist pretensions, so too did Robert Mugabe. But unlike Pol Pot, he held on to power for decades. Repression and corruption became his tools for survival at the top. Mugabe was elected Prime Minister of the newly independent Zimbabwe in 1980. At the time, he seemed like a shining beacon of hope. Zimbabwe's black citizens had been languishing under white minority rule since the English colonized the region in the late 19th century. Now they were free, and they had one of their own as Prime Minister. But any high hopes Zimbabweans might have had for Mugabe were relatively short-lived. Though he did seem committed to improving people's standard of living, he was more concerned with preserving power. Mugabe began by ensuring that the media was compliant. Speeches by Mugabe and his cabinet ministers dominated the front pages of newspapers, and state television was required to subject viewers to frequent doses of propaganda. Police carried out arbitrary arrests across the country, especially of members of the opposition. In Mugabe's Zimbabwe, torture was routine. By 1990, Mugabe had jockeyed himself into a position where he was bypassing parliament and ruling by decree.
Where he could try to muster a challenge, the rigging was very, very primitive. It revolved around, as it were, beating of opposition party members, the stuffing of a ballot box here or there, nothing sophisticated. But it shows there was already disillusionment with his government at that point in time.
Mugabe shored up his popularity by implementing widespread land reforms beginning in 1980. However, Mugabe's cronies benefited the most from land redistribution. In so doing, he created a de facto caste system, with senior members of his political party enjoying a privileged lifestyle, while the rest of the population continued to subsist in much the same way as they had before independence. Corruption among senior members of the party was endemic.
Mugabe maintained power by bribery, maintained power in the first instance by repression of real and imagined enemies, but largely by quite clumsy means up to that point in time. A sophisticated challenge began to appear at the end of the 1990s.
As popularity for his government declined in the 1990s, Mugabe blamed the country's woes on Western nations, and in particular, Zimbabwean whites. This proved effective. From 2000 onwards, the violent seizing of white farms was commonplace, and it was encouraged by Mugabe.
The farm invasions had one immediate effect, and that was they could be distributed. The seized farms could be distributed, firstly among the party faithful, so you got oligarchic support. But this was certainly very, very popular in the first instance. Everyone thought that, yes, finally we own the country. What was missing from the equation was that the country was very prosperous agriculturally because it specialized in commercial produce for export. So the economy began to disintegrate very, very rapidly.
By the early 2000s, the economy was on the verge of collapse. Disease and malnutrition were widespread, and voter suppression was commonplace. In 2005, Mugabe had 700,000 urban residents driven from their homes as punishment for supporting the opposition. 3 years later, he came second in an election to his political opponent, Morgan Tsvangirai. But violence led to Tsvangirai withdrawing his candidacy to avoid his supporters being killed by Mugabe's. Mugabe could not bring himself to relinquish power. At the age of 89, he won another 5-year term as president in a rigged election. The following year, 2014, he appointed his second wife, Grace, to a senior position in the party with a view to making her a key part of his succession plan.
His idea of succession planning was to cultivate the possibility of his much younger wife becoming president in his stead. He was very paranoid that anybody who was not from the family would bring him to justice for economic crimes in particular, not to mention for political vengeance.
In 2017, Mugabe was finally deposed in a military coup, leading to an outpouring of joy in the streets of Harare. The 93-year-old had been in power for 37 years. He died in a Singapore hospital in 2019.
He will go down in the main text of history as someone who was a very contradictory character, but in the end was a failure.
Spanish dictator Francisco Franco held on to power for around the same amount of time. But, unlike Mugabe, he died in office, a fairly popular figure. Despite his violent history as a dictator, this popularity stemmed from a change of strategy, a more liberal shift after one of the most difficult periods of his regime. In the years after the Second World War, Spain's economy was devastated, and as Franco's country faltered, so too did his grip on power. By the early 1950s, he needed to find new ways to bolster his position. He needed to establish credibility on the world stage. But garnering international support in the post-war years was not an easy task for Franco. In 1948, the U.S. began rolling out the Marshall Plan, which delivered $13 billion of aid and helped resurrect the shattered economies of several European countries, including Germany and Italy, but not Spain. Due to Franco's tacit support for Hitler and Mussolini, who had helped him win power, the country was branded an international outcast. If Franco was to win the support of the U.S. and save his failing economy, he needed to reinvent himself.
But now he is going to present himself mainly as an anti-communist dictatorship, preventing the advance of communism in Europe.
As the Cold War intensified in the early 1950s, the U.S. began to look for anti-communist allies wherever it could find them, even if it meant turning a blind eye to state-sanctioned murder and political oppression.
Now in the 1950s, Eisenhower, the American president who has defeated the fascist powers in the Second World War, he visits Spain and embraces Franco, and Spain reaches an agreement with the United States to give the United States rights to have military bases in Spanish territory.
This was ratified as the Madrid Treaty, and it gave Franco enormous credibility, both internationally and domestically. 2 years later, Spain was allowed to become a member of the United Nations, and in 1958, it joined the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. But even with international credibility established, a major problem facing Franco was the dire state of the Spanish economy. He understood that widespread poverty could give rise to civil unrest and pose a threat to his regime. So, improving people's standard of living quickly became a priority. But Franco was far from an economic innovator. In 1957, after a failed attempt at economic self-sufficiency, Franco promoted a more far-sighted group of ministers. They encouraged foreign trade and investment and industrialized the country to some extent. They also opened it up to tourism, which became Spain's main form of income. This coincided with aid from the US and remittances sent from the many Spaniards who had emigrated. The effect was a transformation in the economy that was dubbed the Spanish Miracle.
The 1960s is a period of economic development around the world, particularly in Europe. Spain is also the case. Now there is certain investment and certain economic liberty to produce capitalist development in Spain. So that changes also the narrative and the discourse of Franco as a dictator and the discourse of the regime.
Franco was quick to take credit for these achievements, and it led to a huge rise in his popularity. His increasing liberalism allowed him to retain power through his adaptable dictatorial style, though he would always be just that, a dictator. Popularity alone does not create a long-lasting regime, but it certainly helps. And, as Franco demonstrated, sometimes holding on to power means shifting your ideology. In 1970s China, Mao Zedong decided to do a foreign policy about face, turning away from the Soviet Union and towards the United States. This was motivated in part by a fear that the Soviet Union might invade, following border conflicts 3 years earlier. But Mao also wanted to bolster his image at home. In 1971, China won a place on the UN Security Council with America's backing. This was a major foreign relations triumph for Mao's regime. US President Richard Nixon flew to Beijing in February 1972. Nixon was the first US president to set foot on Chinese soil, and because it shifted the dynamics of the Cold War, he described it as the week that changed the world. The rapprochement made sense for the US in the context of the Vietnam War. The Nixon administration was keen to avoid further conflicts with communist regimes in Asia. It also wanted to isolate North Vietnam, as well as undermine the Soviet Union's relationships with other communist nations. For Mao, meeting Nixon was a major propaganda coup, and he created the impression that the president had come fawning to him. Mao Zedong died in 1976. Many young people in particular, those more likely to have been indoctrinated, were grief-stricken, as were those who remembered that Mao had to some extent empowered China's workers and peasants and placed the country firmly on the world stage. But others were delighted with his death, in particular those who knew that he had deliberately or accidentally killed vast numbers of his people, possibly up to 80 million, and inflicted untold suffering on countless more.
After Mao's death, there's a brief interregnum under Hua Guofeng, and then Deng Xiaoping takes over and opens the country up fully to market liberalization. But Deng Xiaoping had this appraisal of Mao as 70% good, 30% bad, acknowledging that Mao and the CCP, himself included, had made some mistakes with the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, but ultimately the gains far outweighed the failures. And that ultimately becomes still to this day the appraisal of Mao. He's the national father. His thought is ever present in party practice.
Mao ruled through brutal repression, but despite the horrors of his reign, he successfully maintained power until his death. Only the communist dictatorships tend to survive the death of the dictators themselves, and China remains a communist autocratic state to this day. And throughout the country, the image of Mao Zedong persists as well. To a very great extent, the ability of a dictator to stay in power depends on the willingness of their people to let them do so. Dictators exploit an instinct to seek protection from a strong leader, to yearn for order, certainty, and prosperity, even at the cost of certain freedoms. For the dictators themselves, the power they've acquired is addictive. It is why they're prepared to take increasingly drastic actions to keep it, from repression to reformation, propaganda to punishment. To remain all-powerful, a true dictator would do anything.